Mr. Chair, you are live.
Welcome, everybody. I'm going to call the Thursday, December 15th Planning Commission meeting to order. First order of business is the roll call. Kimberly, please.
Mr. Klein,
Present.
Mr. Waldman,
Present.
Ms. Rubio Dorsey,
Present.
Ms. Butler,
Present.
Mr. Sale,
Here.
and Mr. Svakianudis will arrive a little bit late.
Great. Thank you. All righty. Next order of business is the approval of minutes from December 1st. I trust everybody's had a chance to review those. I would, unless anybody wants me to display them, I would entertain a motion to approve them.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? I'm happy to bring them up if there is any discussion. Not hearing any. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions?
And I abstain, wasn't here last meeting.
Great, thanks, Ben. All right, the minutes from December 1st are approved. Okay, first, so on our agenda tonight, we have two public hearings. First one is ordinance 11-22, food service standards for the purpose of modifying additional standards for food and beverage related uses in the B1 district that are subject to special exception. For anybody who wants to get all of the details that we will talk about and may present here tonight and e-track it, the project number to look at is ZTA Zulu Tango Alpha 2022, no space between those, -003. And that'll get you all of the public comments, the staff report, etc. Okay, so we'll start out with Mr. Lashinsky is going to give us an overview of the staff report. And I'm happy to display that report while you're talking, Eric, if you'd like.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, go ahead and start and I'll pull it up while you're talking.
All right. Good evening. Eric Lashinsky, Chief of Comprehensive Planning. I co-wrote the staff report with Jackie Rouse from Current Planning, Department of Planning and Zoning. This ordinance is focused on the B1 zoning district, which is, relatively limited in geographic scope. It only applies to areas in Ward 2, the West Annapolis area, and specifically properties along Annapolis Street in Ward 2, and then a few different sites in Ward 8, in the Eastport area. One being along Bay Ridge Avenue, another being along 6th Street, and another area along Chester Avenue, vicinity of Davis's Pub. So basic idea for this legislation is to amend the requirements for this zone as they relate to restaurant standards and bring those standards in line with the standards that already exist for the other business zoning districts, the B2, B3, et cetera, which provide for additional flexibility for those restaurants. And, the motivation for the bill, as I understand it, is that there are people in the city today who are looking for more dining and payment options, and that is the goal here, to provide for more flexibility in the types of dining and bar options that exist in the city. And this is basically focus on areas where we've heard that request. So the verdict that we came to just in kind of reviewing the legislation, the kind of opinion that we had as staff, was that this was a good thing for the city. And the thinking is that the uses that this would allow would still only be allowed through a special exception process, which is a pretty rigorous review process. Those special exception uses would still have to come before the appeals board. And there's a whole set of guidelines that a potential applicant would have to go through to meet the standards for a special exception. And when I say rigorous, you want to go up to the staff report, Alex, Chairman Klein. We kind of listed out the areas of review. So if you keep going up, special exception approval is for those who are not familiar with, there are a number of land uses allowed in the city by special exception in most of our zoning districts. And the idea here is that this is a use that in theory could be compatible with other land uses in the nearby, either adjacent or in the nearby vicinity, but we need to look at a host of other aspects of this land use to ensure that it will in fact be compatible and we can mitigate potential negative impacts, et cetera. So, for standard special exception review, you could see we list out environmental, traffic. Scroll down a little bit. I'm sorry. These are for restaurants specifically. We go kind of to another level of special exception review, which then looks even closer, scrutinizes the project even further to understand the impacts it's going to have on adjacent property owners. And so environmental, traffic, neighborhood, adequacy of public facilities. These are things that, still basically they have to meet a bar here to a standard to be acceptable. And there's opportunity for public comment on all of these as it comes to the appeals board. So, and staff looks at this looks at the project through this lens as well. So, for this reason, we felt that the code provides an adequate level of scrutiny for these projects. And I should say that, if you go back to the beginning of the staff report, the basic idea that kind of can walk through essentially what we're talking about in terms of what would be allowed in the B1 district that is currently allowed in the B2, the B3, the B3CD, and the PM districts by special exception. You would be allowed a bar where you do not need to eat at the same time, dancing, live entertainment indoors. Your hours of operation could be extended past midnight. Rooftop dining is allowed, subject to alcoholic beverages can only be served with food. So that is outdoor. Rooftop dining. The hours of operation shall be limited to 10 p.m. 7 days a week on the rooftops. No bar, dancing, or live entertainment, no speakers or public address system shall be allowed. No portion of a rooftop dining area may be located any closer than 75 feet from a residential structure measured horizontally at grade. The rooftop dining area may not exceed 25% of the floor area of the indoor restaurant area and may not have more than 25% of the number of seats in the indoor restaurant area. Access to the rooftop dining area shall be through the interior of the restaurant, and exterior access shall be allowed only as an emergency access for fire and life safety purposes. Lighting shall be directed away from adjoining properties and streets and designed to minimize glare. All lighting shall be at or below railing level. The design of the rooftop dining area shall include noise mitigation measures that will minimize adverse impacts on adjoining properties. So I just wanted to kind of read through that just to kind of underscore that there are pretty significant restrictions as far as staff are concerned in place to minimize impacts. And, again, every single project would be going through the appeals process. So I believe that's the extent of the analysis. We approved the ordinance with no conditions, and we're happy to answer questions if they come.
Eric, Ms. Shinsky, Mr. Lashinsky, have you had the opportunity to read Mr. Arnett's comments?
I could. He could. Oh, have I had the chance to read them? Yes, I have. Yes.
You have. What are your reactions? I think what he's saying is that this would affect basically Ward 2 and Ward 8, and that they're very different interests and very different kind of community fabric in both of those places, in both of those wards. And I assume he's reflecting the feelings of his constituency about their disinclination to allow, more restaurants, or I'm not quite sure exactly what, but he proposes a couple of thoughts. One of them is to create a Ward B1A and a Ward B1B, with more freedom, so to speak, in Ward 2 rather than would be allowed in Ward 8. And another option would be to exempt the existing 6th Street business district from the ordinance. Do you have any thoughts on those on those suggestions?
Mr. Waldman, so I think it actually, he's also, both of the areas that all of the B1 areas in Ward 8 are also in the OCD overlay. They're the stretch of property. If Alex could put the map back up, you can see that all of those areas are B1 and they're also in an OCD overlay. And I think when he referred to exempting them, I think his concept may have been that because they're in the OCD overlay, they could be, the legislation would not apply to B1 property in the OCD overlay, so to speak. And that would allow, that type of amendment to the legislation would not require the creation of two separate zoning districts, one for West Annapolis and one for Ward 2 and one for Ward 8, because all of the B1 is in those two wards. So I think that's really what he was saying in his comments that he sent us to clarify.
Can you just give me a brief summary of what the OCD district is, how it's different from its surrounding areas?
It's an overlay zone. It's actually called the Office and Corridor Design Overlay District, and it just creates, I guess if I had to describe it, I would say it as being like, it's an additional standards for design and development overlay district, much like we used to have like the neighborhood conservation overlay districts that then got combined with with residential districts, but the OCD stayed as an overlay zone. So it just has additional development design standards that are applied to B1, but we don't have that overlay in Ward 2, just in Ward 8.
Okay.
So that is, I think that's one of his suggestions that he made in the legislation. And I'll let Eric speak to the possibility of creating two B1 zoning districts, a B1A and a B1B. Remember, we used to have a B1 and a B1A, and when we remapped, we got rid of the B1A and made it all just B1. So we would be going back in the other direction again. And I do believe one of our goals is to reduce the tremendous number of zoning districts we have in the city
Okay,
as we move forward. But Eric can give you a better.
No, that's
Response for that.
accurate. Jackie's mentioning of the OCD overlay existing precisely where these B1 properties are in Ward 8 is a good one, because that would be a far more straightforward way of addressing the concerns that Alderman Arnett has raised. And we're really not trying to create additional zones at this point. That's a pretty significant goal in the upcoming comprehensive plan, and just really trying to simplify our zoning code as much as possible. So, yeah,
Now,
Jackie's suggestion.
right.
Would be
I
good.
would like to clarify that the OC district is an office and commercial design overlay district. It's in chapter 2158 of the city code. And that solution would need to be reviewed by the Office of Law as to whether or not that would be an appropriate way to limit uses, because it is a design and development, it is a design overlay. So that, I don't know if Alderman Arnett has discussed that potentially with the Office of Law in exploring his options for amendment. So I just putting that out there, that's something that would have to be reviewed, and we would have to get know that they felt that was an acceptable process, so to speak.
so actually with respect to Ward 8, there are actually two different things going on, two different ways that communities can weigh in, and specific projects can be analyzed and reviewed and passed or not passed upon. One of them is the special exception process itself with the additional restaurant reviews. And the second is whatever is required in this OCD,
Right.
which frankly, I confuse with obsessive compulsive disorder, but that's just me.
Yes. I would be happy to download that chapter
No, I
from
can.
the code
What was it
and
again?
email it to all of you if you
It's-
want. I can do that
Okay.
right now.
2158.
It's 2158, yes.
Yeah, I've got it.
I think that
Right.
would be good, Jackie. I think that might be helpful.
Okay, I'm going to be doing that right now as you continue to discuss.
All right. Thank you. That's, at this point, that's the only question I have. Thanks.
So I'm going to back up a little bit and just ask a couple more basic questions, just to make sure I have this really straight in my mind to Eric. So really, and actually looking at the legislation so I've just shifted to that. So all it really does is basically allows everything that's in the B2 to be in the B1. The only thing that's in the B2 with respect to restaurants here is that you can have more than 50 seats with the special exception. And so you can do that now, but this basically adds all of these other things to that special exception process. That's
Correct. It
Okay,
allows more flexibility
yeah,
for
I
restaurants
understand.
located in the B1 district. And
Want to make sure I got that.
you're
So-
absolutely right. And let me just say one more thing about the structure of our food service regulations in the city. These were created in, I think, 1985, which is 37 years ago. And, they are very, there have been some additions to them, modifications. Remember, we added rooftop dining a few years ago, but basically they've remained very similar to their original structure. And the nature of the food service business, and especially the operation of a standard restaurant, has changed with the times. And I think that it became especially apparent, during the pandemic, that people just don't go to a restaurant and sit down and have a meal and go home. People like to be able to then maybe also sit in and have a drink, or have a drink before they sit down at their table. And in the B1 district, those are not options that you have to even do incidental things like that. So it just gives more, it provides an opportunity for more flexibility in the B1 district. Not every restaurant in the B1 district will be interested in doing this. We recently took Evelyn's through an expansion application, and his hours are like till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And when I took him through the special exception process to add seats, I said, wouldn't you like to get later hours so that you could potentially be open in the evenings? And he said, absolutely not. It's not part of my business plan, and I don't want that. So not every restaurant will automatically decide that they're going to add all these other things. It really has to do with the type of restaurant you have in your business plan and how you operate. So
Yeah, and so another couple of questions.
mhm.
I'm asking these questions because the way some of the comments were worded, I wanted to make this explicit, but it doesn't move all of the requirements for the B1 district are still the B1 districts, the bulk requirements and stuff.
Nothing else changes. No,
Right.
still have to
Jackie,
comply
hold
with
on.
all, right.
Can I finish my
Absolutely.
question, please?
I'm sorry.
So all of the way it was worded in some of the comments was it's moving the B1 code under, it's moving the B1 district under the B1 code. And as I read this, all it does is just change these special exception requirements. That's correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
I think there was some misunderstanding on some people's parts about, how the code actually is structured and functions, but
Yeah,
you're
okay.
absolutely correct.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that was explicit as we talk about this.
Mhm.
The other question that I have, and this is for Eric, is how would the West Annapolis master plan that I guess will be unveiled when public comment goes for the gets going for the passage of the comprehensive plan? That's a big question for me, because as was stated earlier, maybe the areas in Eastport and West Annapolis are different, although my sense of the neighborhood here, I live in West Annapolis, so I have a pretty good sense of the neighborhood, that I think anything that abuts a residential neighborhood is going to have the same feelings that the folks in Eastport have. So my sense is they're not that different, but tell me how you think that will, the master plan will affect this. Because
this is consistent with the master plan as far as I consider it. I mean, when we did the master plan, we heard just simply a lot of interest in having more dining options, and with dining options, it really helps to have additional flexibility to bring in vendors who see value, and think they can be successful there. I mean, I think there's been historically turnover of restaurants in West Annapolis because of some of the limitations, not necessarily code related, but just the geography, the demographics, and so forth. And I think one thing that seemed to be clear in what we heard during the master plan was just an understanding that some greater flexibility was needed to really kind of provide the mix. But
so let me ask this in a more
yeah.
pointed way, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Would the master plan provide that? Say this legislation doesn't go anywhere and things stay the same.
Uh-huh.
Would the master plan then provide that flexibility for West Annapolis without affecting Eastport? That's really the crux of my question.
Well, one of the big, yes and no. It wouldn't happen very quickly. So one of the, what the master plan is trying to do, one of the big ideas in the master plan was essentially a rezoning of the commercial area of West Annapolis to make it more sensible in regard to the context of the area. You know, you look at the zoning districts today, it's kind of like a puzzle of different zoning districts that don't make a lot of intuitive sense. I mean, there's general themes you can pick out, but the idea behind the master plan was to say, well, you have these major asset in your established residential neighborhood. You have your Annapolis Street neighborhood, Main Street. You have a much higher volume Raoul Boulevard. You have your cherished shopping center. You know, and the desire was to sort of protect all of these key features and have the zoning districts actually be in relation to that context. You know, so you sort of preserve the Main Street, Annapolis Street with one zoning district, and you kind of move and you preserve the shopping center with another zoning district. And then you kind of move from Annapolis Street to Raoul Boulevard, and you kind of scale things accordingly. So the farther you are from the residential area, the scale gets slightly larger. Nothing really gets over 4 stories, but that's really what you have at Raoul Boulevard, where it's a much higher volume roadway. And so that was kind of the sense. And we started moving on a zoning code update that's called form-based code that you all have heard from me talk about. But really that wouldn't be able to happen until the comprehensive plan is adopted. And that's probably not going to be till this summer. So that zoning change wouldn't happen really fast, but the idea would be ultimately to move towards a zoning code that is much more based on retaining the character of the buildings and having them be sensible, in regard to their context, their forms, enhancing the character of the neighborhood, and less focused on strict, guidelines for uses. But that's in a nutshell how form-based code works. You really control the building envelope, and you provide more flexibility for what happens inside the building. And so, I guess to answer your question, the master plan was moving in that direction, but it just wouldn't be happening expediently, I would say.
But any changes to zoning, like, as we talked about briefly before about exempting, I mean, I guess with respect to this legislation, it's different, but if you were to make other changes to these zones, in a sense, to separate some of the sense of Eastport, the Eastport context, the West Annapolis context, without the master plan, that's still going to take a fair amount of time.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And I've spoken to Alderwoman O'Neill about trying to have that master plan adopted, sooner than the comp. It was done in the context of the comp plan, but it was kind of a standalone document, and it was pretty well supported by the community. And so we haven't moved it forward yet, but she's aware of that.
So we don't have to get into that really in any more detail. I just was trying to explore, knowing that that's out there and coming, is that a way that West Annapolis is allowed to diverge if they so choose without affecting what happens in Eastport? And I think the answer is yes, but in a longer term.
Yeah.
Is that a statement?
I'll just say one more thing, which is that, just to be kind of blunt about it, the form-based code initiative, one of its major goals was essentially to consolidate the many different commercial and office zones that we have into kind of mixed use zones that would be based on context and desired character. So, we had a zone in the master plan called Village Main Street for Annapolis Street that in theory could apply to parts of Eastport Ward 8, but we weren't thinking about that. We were looking at types of zones, form-based zones that in theory might be applicable elsewhere in the city and not only in West Annapolis. And, you know, so that was the hope. So we could kind of help to consolidate these zones everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, well, those were the questions, specific questions that I had, to really more just clarification. Anybody else, any other commissioners have questions before, to clarify or get into more detail of what this is asking about? I think you're muted, Ben.
Alex, I'd like to present the zoning map and ask with my questions. It helps me get my point across.
Yeah, I actually have the,
If you could take yours down, I have mine already queued up, be a lot fast. There you
Oh,
go. Thank you.
yeah, go ahead.
It'd be more efficient.
Yep.
Boom, boom. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. I don't have my glasses with me because I forgot them. So, and I already read through the document I was presented, but I wanted to go through it again and I can't. So I need to ask you a question. You have the B1 here, and logically, when you have zoning, right, we're flowing from business, bigger business, down to, you're going to go to R1. So how do you transition? You have your B1 zone, and the B1 zone being a lesser impactful entity to bordering properties in R1. Am I correct in that statement roughly? That's why the B1 exists there? I'll just take that as a general yes. Now, on one side of Annapolis Street, the west side over here, all of those businesses immediately with the legislation as proposed, I don't have much of an issue. But on the other side, I start thinking, well, there are residents behind it, but they have this fantastic street of division, a back alley street, which has been somewhat paved due to a previous project we've approved. And mind you, the building that went up over there looks pretty darn good, that we talked about in the past and went through here. But looking at this, I'll zoom in one more time. So it's 13 properties on the northeast side of Annapolis Street that this B1 becoming more so B2 would affect. And then you have all these houses back here. Now I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the houses in the back. Here you go. You can see the satellite view now. Can you see the satellite view, gentlemen and lady?
Yep.
Okay. So these are the 13 properties, right? You got West Annapolis Elementary up here, and you got the 13 properties on the northeast side of Annapolis in the B2 zone. Obviously, southwest side of Annapolis is B2 as well. I'm sorry, B1, and this is B1. But you have a lot of homes. They do have a nice, that back alley kind of, separates them and gives them a buffer. So if we go down to the street level, and this right here, this intersection is this. We're going to start you right here, and I'm going to walk you down real quick to here and take a quick look. All right. So Giddings, we're going to go down. And you see there's houses back here, right? And then we get to that little back alleyway street. And here it is. Now, if we start having outdoor dining and restaurants over here, you can see how it would start to get noisy for some of these residents. Right now, they have an expectation of quietness. You think most of these businesses, not much is happening past 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, so you can get some good sleep and be peaceful and quiet. If we start opening up things for maybe 1 or 2 businesses, if it just takes one out of these 13 properties to be able to stay open until midnight, outdoor dining, and things start getting a little louder, me personally, if I'm young in my 30s and 20s, I wouldn't mind living here, but I don't know who's living there now. I don't know how much of an issue they have. So that's my point to it. And what I want to ask of staff is, if you're going to be one of these businesses over on this side of that little back alley in that street, as it stands now with B1, can you have outdoor dining in an open area as it stands with B1?
Yes, you can outdoor dining is already allowed. If you go back to looking at the legislation and where it lists what you can have in in B1 now, you can, yes, you can have outdoor dining.
So everything I'm kind of worried about and just said, you can already kind of do anyway, right, Jackie?
Yes, and I will say that, and we do have several restaurants that exist on Annapolis Street that are already approved for outdoor dining. Actually,
But it's
all of
not on the
them
back
are-
side. They're doing it on the front side from what
Right,
I've-
they're doing it on the front side. You know, we have not had anybody come in and say they want to do outdoor dining on the back, and we actually just approved, there was just a new restaurant approved in the new building that you all approved for site design, I think
Which is right
last
about
year.
there, which is right down there.
It's
we
the
don't
one
see-
on, it's the one on the even side. It's 106,
Yeah,
108, I
It's
think.
agave, I guess. Yeah.
You're
Oh.
right, and it is a restaurant that's been approved and is under permit to go in there at this point in time also.
Where's it going to be? It's not going to be on the back side. It's going to be on the front side and
Right.
inside, right?
Yeah,
Ben,
it's
I
on the
think if
inside,
I-
but I think they have proposed outdoor dining with that. They have a number of
They
outdoor
have a,
dining
but they have
seats.
it would be on the front side porch. Ben, I
Right.
think what you're getting at, the piece that's really different here is rooftop.
Mhm.
That's
Or
something that
backside. I mean, I don't know if anybody would be interested in putting it on the backside, but
probably not, but I think a rooftop is.
yeah. And then going back to the zoning, if it, we haven't started all of our deliberations yet. And I just want to point out for staff, has there been any question of making, if it does come to that, making one side of the street could totally go this way and maybe the other side, maybe we restrict it more so. I know that comes down to finite element analysis of zoning, which people don't like, but just thoughts. But I just want to get it out to the public and make sure with staff that you can already have dining restaurants. You can already have outdoor dining, just rooftop dining in the B1, you can't, right? And 50 seats or more is the big addition here, right, Jackie?
That's true. The only thing you can get in B1 through special exception is more than 50 seats other than the base things. But let me just give you some food for thought here.
Food.
Is that if you could make recommendations to say, you know, that you support, you could look at each individual additional thing that's being proposed, like, okay, we're okay with an
Hey,
indoor bar.
Jackie, hold
And
on a
then you
second.
could-
Jackie,
you
hold
could-
on a
you could-
second.
Hmm.
Can we delay that discussion until our
absolutely.
deliberation?
We're not to that point.
Yeah,
Let's go now.
let's-
So my question of what you can have already in B1 versus what we're trying to do, I think has been answered. And I just wanted to show the
Yes.
picture of how it's kind of almost two
Mhm.
little animals we're worried about here, one more so than the other in the B1. But and also in the future, are we looking at getting rid of the B1s and the B2s all and just making it all one general district?
That would be an Eric
No.
question.
No, it wouldn't be one general district. We'd be actually looking at similar number of districts. Like for this commercial area, there's I think there's four different districts currently. They would just be oriented differently. So that's really the main difference. And they'd have different guidelines, you know, based on desired uses and forms. But
And you also mentioned there was questions Alex had for the comprehensive plan. I believe from the comprehensive plan over the last few years that we've worked with, that this actually feeds right into what we're trying to do with West Annapolis and make it more of a place where, like after Naval Academy games, people would want to cross the street and go over there and eat at restaurants. We'd want to have things happen. And Annapolis Street is one of those streets where we targeted that and looked at it. And of course, when you do that, there's going to be a residential area that abuts in the back. However, we do have that nice lane. But this does dovetail into what we wanted to do with the comprehensive plan. And I'm not sure if I'd have to look back right now on what the residents of West Annapolis commented exactly with that. But I believe most of them were for plussing up the area, exactly where. And now we're kind of seeing it come to fruition. And that you might get some, pushback. But on the whole, Annapolis Street is what we were targeting, I believe. So that's all I have right now, Mr. Klein. And thank you, staff. You've clarified what I thought, and we'll just keep going through, see where we get. Thank you, Alex.
Great. Thanks. Okay, anybody else have questions?
Jackie was about to make some comments. Is this an appropriate moment for her to continue? Offer some suggestions? Mr. Pline, would this be?
Well, let's, no, I think we want to just finish up asking any clarification questions and then get the public hearing open and hear from the folks that are here to.
Oh, I actually do have one final question.
And Jackie, don't forget your thought there. Write it down.
Yeah, don't forget your thoughts, because has the city received any feedback on the rooftop dining that is in place and is happening either downtown or anywhere? Is 10 o'clock, the inappropriate time to cut off rooftop dining? Are the noise limits being followed? Are
Good question.
people living with it easily, or is it becoming oppressive to the surrounding neighborhoods? Do we have any feedback on any of this? Eric, Jackie?
We have not, the places that we have approved for rooftop dining since we adopted the rooftop dining regulations, which are in that legislation that Alex previously had, would be like Blackwell Hitch. We approved, and we've not had complaints. I mean, there are some very strict requirements in that legislation, that some of which you all added to it to strengthen it, that have to do with distance from adjacent nearest residential use, with sound baffling, not allowing any kind of an outside bar. All the lighting has to be below rail level. You can't have any kind of speakers or outdoor, so there were a number of restrictions that were put in that it's pretty tight. And I don't know of any complaints we've had about it, but we don't have a lot of restaurants that have actually availed themselves of that. So.
Okay. I remember when we put them in, and it was in the context of what used to be faucets and now is whatever it is.
Well, I know
And
Mr.
I
Ives is not
remember,
here.
I remember that well.
Mhm.
So
When we added it to the zone, when the new zoning was put in place for that particular maritime zone, I think they may have gotten a little bit more flexibility in terms of hours than we have in other zoning districts. But that's also, property that's located, downtown. So I think that was a consideration in why they should have more flexibility in terms of the hours. But there's largely the same.
okay.
We pay
Yeah, I
a
think-
lot of attention to that in terms of the review process, in terms of how it's being designed and requiring noise baffling, because we are really concerned about it not noise, especially if it's a waterfront location. Noise travels very easily over the water.
Okay.
And
Okay, but Blackwell Hitch is in a neighborhood and you haven't had any complaints.
no, they have a wall on that side where it's closest to the nearest residential use. So it was really designed well to protect there's actually only one adjacent residential use. Now, of course, as we move towards having more mixed use development where, you look on Interwest Street, where we have residences and commercial mixed in together, that's just something that's the way the whole corridor is designed. So one would assume that if people are buying condominium units, like at the building where there's there's a coffee shop with residential uses upstairs, that they're aware that they're buying $1 million unit and they're over top of a restaurant.
Mhm.
So the dynamic is a little different there, that you would be looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Teresa? Anything you want to ask, or?
No, I think the staff report was fairly clear that this ordinance simply makes, B1 more consistent with the B1, I'm sorry, B2 and other zoning areas, and modifying the special exception. So I'm pretty comfortable with what was presented by staff.
Okay, Diane?
No, I don't really have
Oh.
any questions right now. Just seems
Okay.
like we're doing piecemeal what the comprehensive plan is trying to do.
Okay, so at this point, I think we've had all the clarifying questions. So I want to open the public hearing for 1122, and so it'll open here, and we will take questions from or testimony from the public, and it will stay open until our next meeting, at which time we will close it and have our deliberations. But so let's do that. So I see we have several Alder people here to I would presume that want to give some testimony. And do we have any members of the public signed up to speak?
We do not have any members of the public signed up to speak tonight. However, we did forward comments to you today from the
Yep.
Eastport Civic Association.
Yep,
And those are
so-
the only public comments. I think you had some public comments attached to the original package that was sent to you prior to the last meeting.
Yes, we had
Mhm.
the ones from Eastport Civic Association and several members of the public.
Right.
And we won't display those here, but again, anybody who's listening can go to eTrack and read those. And rest assured that we have read all of them.
So one more thing, Alex, I've just
Yep.
had an email from Mr. Safakanudis that he apologizes, but he's unable to join the meeting tonight, but he will review it and review the audio and video of it.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the public hearing is open, and I presume Mr. Arnett and wants to speak. Who else? Just so we can gauge who else. Ms. Tierney, you want to speak also?
Mute.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, I was able, I'm not here for public testimony, but you had asked a question outside dining examples, and I didn't know if it was appropriate if I could respond to that specific to Chop Tank and complaints. If not, I can do that under separate cover.
Yeah, why don't you do that? I think if that were in a B1 or in a district that more similar.
Yeah, there was, I think someone had asked, are there examples of outside dining downtown? And I could speak to that, but.
Yeah. Well,
maybe-
I know our esteemed Mr. Iams would take exception to that rooftop dining because of the interference it has with the Summer Garden Theater. But anyway, okay, so I guess the only person that is here now to speak on this is Alderman Arnett. So why don't you tell us what you have to say?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to begin by reemphasizing my agreement with Commissioner Rubio Dorsey from the last meeting that I don't think this is the place for alderpersons to either advocate or argue against legislation. So I present myself as available to answer questions. I did give you a submission today. I apologize.
I think your audio is cutting out.
I cut it off.
Oh.
Sorry. I would just point out that B2 is twice as prevalent in Ward 8 as it is in Ward 2. I do think there is a mindset difference between the residents who live in Ward 8 and Ward 2, in that the Ward 8 residents are feeling a little gun shy about quite a big influx in new restaurants and quite a bit of noise and parking and traffic issues. We've been over that in our discussions of 09. So I will only make one other comment, and that is that I do attend the Board of Appeals, and I do listen to hearings for special exceptions, and I have absolutely no recollection of any special exception. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened, of ever being denied. And I asked the chair of the board, and he said, because the board assumes that by the time it gets to them, the staff have fully vetted it and there's no reason for denying the special exception. But he also offered a criticism essentially of me, saying that the standards and criteria make it very hard to deny a special exception request. Even when there are unusual things, like at the hearing last week, unusual shape of property or not unusual. So I guess I would not feel comfortable in you feeling that Mr. Lashinsky's argument is that there's this real recourse because there's a special exception process. And I'll only add to that that I've had discussions. I do want to work with Alderwoman O'Neill. I have been working with her, and I do think that we will come to some sort of a win-win accommodation. That'll probably happen after the Planning Commission. But I did suggest the two amendments that occurred to me, and actually they both came from the planning staff, that I have discussed with Karma, and will continue to consider it. But it would be valuable to me to hear what the commission thinks about either of those possible amendments that can let Ward 8 and Ward 2 be different. So that's all I'll say unless you have questions.
Ross, I have a question. Can you tell us about those amendments right now briefly?
Yeah, one of them would be to create a subset. So a B1A and a B1B, which one would be Ward 8, one would be Ward 2. I know exactly what Mr. Lashinsky and probably I think the Planning Commission too are thinking. We have 31 different zoning designations. They're all over the map and we probably need fewer. We'll see when we get to the comp plan how that works out. The other amendment was to exempt the OCD, the 6th Street OCD, which only affects those restaurants around 6th Street and Chesapeake. And that happens to be where there's 2 new restaurants that are applying to come in. I think they both sound, well, the Caribbean one sounds yummy to me, and it's a half a block away, so I plan to visit it. But there is this feeling of a lot of pressure on the part of the residents. Feelings are not the same as reality, but they are something that I have to deal with as an elected official. You can always imagine the worst possible outcome. My experience is that we don't approach that, but I do have to try to balance those concerns when I work on legislation that affects my constituents.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else have any questions for Alderman Arnett?
Well, Mr. Arnett's Bob Waldman. I asked a question earlier whether the OCD district would be sufficient to, in addition to the special exception process, to sort of, I guess the goal of Eastport Civic Association is to limit the number of restaurants. Is that right?
I can't speak for them.
Okay, but would the OCD work in that capacity?
The OCD will work for 6th Street at Chester, between Bay Ridge and Chester. It does not work for all, the majority of the B1 zoning in Ward 8 is along Bay Ridge Avenue up by VIN 909.
Mhm.
That is not in the OCD district.
Mhm.
So again, it was
Actually,
an attempt.
It actually is in the OCD
Well, then-
district.
Then it would work for the purposes of differentiating Ward 8 from Ward 2. I'm not advocating that. I'm trying to find something that can make my constituents' preferences, which are different than the preferences that seem to be those of Ward 2. So in talking with Karma, talking with other planning staff than those here tonight, that was an option. And if it does actually go up Bay Ridge, that would be an option. I would just add, I think when we get to the comp plan, all of this is going to change, or at least it's going to be proposed to change. So, you know, we're dealing with a fairly temporal situation, and that is exactly what Karma's facing. She has a restaurant that wants to add a bar and they can't now, and another restaurant that wants to add amplified music and they can't now. And I have a hard time telling her she shouldn't fight for those. Those are meeting a demand or a need of her constituents, and good on them.
Have you had an opportunity to look at the letter from the Eastport Civic Association?
Yes, I have.
It says that from their perspective, that if this legislation is passed, that it would allow for late night operations inside and outside, rooftop dining and so forth. And then they go on to say that they ask that that the proposed ordinance provide the same protections as are already included in the code for rooftop dining, and then goes on to list each and every one of those requirements. We just got testimony from the planning staff that those same requirements, rooftop dining requirements, would be imposed if this legislation passes, would be imposed on the new zoning. Do you understand that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
And
Does the ECA have it wrong?
no, in B2, you can have amplified music, you can have a bar, you can have more than 50 patrons, you can stay open until 2.
Yeah, but that's all amplified music and so forth is all inside. The rooftop dining, now it's not talking about outside dining, it's just talking about rooftop dining. But that cuts off at 10, no amplification whatsoever. Lighting, we heard about all of these different, very clear and distinct regulations.
Yes.
They apply to rooftop dining.
Yes, they do.
Okay, so
But rooftop dining is
thinks that
only
there should be
one
an amendment to this, but I don't think that that's necessary.
I don't disagree with you. All I'm saying is rooftop dining is only one of the expansions when you move from B1 to B2. And so,
I agree. I understand.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
Mr. Chair, to tap on to Mr. Wallman's comment, if you pull up the actual staff report and the modifications to the actual standard itself, you'll notice that in section C2.
Okay, you gotta find it here.
Special exception, you're talking about special exception will not be injurious to?
Yeah,
Not
actually, I'm pulling up the actual standards for use under Title 21 for the B1 special exception. If you
Right, 21-26-050.
correct.
Right.
Yeah, and if you go into B and you got catering, and then C has all the things that Mr. Wallman referred to, where all use is permitted to standards, no more than 50 seats, so on and so on in section C. The only line that is crossed out is line 2, which limits the current B1 standard and simply adds B1 to item 2, which is now modified. And all those exceptions that Mr. Waldman listed are still listed there. So I just wanted to clarify that the only modification to this is simply adding B1 to the existing restrictions that that the rest of the zones are subject to.
Which would be done restaurant by special exception.
Correct.
Yes, I agree. I worked with Karma.
Okay, just making sure, because I too was confused by the Eastport Civic Association letter, because it implied that those restrictions were somehow not included or excluded or disregarded.
I think what they are thinking is that the rooftop exceptions, which by the way vary from zone to zone, should be the exceptions that would apply to the things like amplified music and outdoor dining and things like that. I would point out to you, we don't have an outdoor dining code yet. So I don't think we can talk about how it would apply to outdoor dining, but the notion was that the rooftop dining has been very successful. Blackwell Hitch has been a very good neighbor, and I have received personally as alderman 0 complaints about that rooftop dining. I think part of that's because it does close at 10. It does not have amplified music. There are a number of other things, and they have been very good neighbors in adhering to all of that. And I think what the ECA is saying is that is a way of having this expansion work well for the surrounding neighbors. They'll need to speak to that themselves, but that's my sense of what they're saying.
Thank you.
So Alex, can I just point out one thing that I think is not quite accurate, and it's related to what you have on the screen in front of you. If you go up above the line that Teresa just referred to that's crossed out, you don't have to go quite that far, where you see D, outdoor dining with the exception of rooftop dining may be permitted subject to the following. And those are the standards currently in place for all restaurants if you go back up to C, you'll see all the zones that those apply to, that outdoor dining is required to comply with. Hours of operation limited to 10 p.m. 7 days a week. No speakers or public address system shall be allowed. No bar dancing or live entertainment is permitted except in the PM district where indoor live none. That's just generally speaking for restaurants, but there are standards related to hours of operation, service of alcohol only with food, and no speakers or public address system. So that we do have standards for outdoor dining. I think what's gotten a lot of people confused about what's allowed for restaurants and not allowed for restaurants was that when the pandemic began, the city administration made the decision to allow through a process not regulated by zoning a number of privileges for restaurants to continue to operate during the pandemic, during the states of emergency. And a lot of stuff was allowed that would not have been allowed had any of those restaurants had to go through a normal zoning review process.
Yeah, okay. Agreed. Okay, so anybody else have either further questions for Mr. Arnett or staff? If not, I think we can leave this public hearing open until the next meeting. And so anybody else have any further thing they want to ask? Okay, not hearing no other questions. So we'll leave this open till the next meeting. And if anybody in the public wants to submit comments based on what they've heard here, clarifications and explanations of the legislation, to revise comments they've already sent or submit new ones, please use the form on the website as per usual, or sign up to speak at our next meeting. Okay. Thank you all for working through that. Now, our next order is ordinance -49-22, parking fee for the purpose of authorizing a parking fee in lieu for certain businesses required to provide parking spaces and generally relating to off-street parking requirements. And so the E-Tracket number for that is ZTA 2022-006. If anybody wants to go read all of the background material there. So I guess, again, Eric, are you going to give us a little overview on this?
Yeah, I'll just give you the high points of the staff report.
Okay, and I have it here if you want me to present anything.
Yeah, you can bring it up. That would be great.
All right.
This one, this ordinance is coming to you at a time when there's been a few other pieces of legislation floating around in different stages of process, you know, that are related. So you've seen 0922, which is another ordinance that is specifically related to parking and is proposing to eliminate the parking requirements for restaurant uses, and with no stipulation on how that additional space could be used. And when that came before you, actually, let me step back for a moment and just say that the way we reviewed this legislation was in the context of 0922, not only because that they both address off-street parking, but because when 0922 was brought before council on first reader, and some amendments were already suggested at that point. One of them was a sort of a fee in lieu amendment, and the recommendation, the opinion of the Office of Law was that that amendment was substantially different than the legislation and needed to be its own piece of legislation. And with that context, we saw 4922 as a response to that opinion from the Office of Law, and kind of reviewed it in that context. You know, that this is something that was, you know, related to 0922 and a response to that. And for that reason, when looking at the primary sort of foundation of this ordinance 04922 being a fee in lieu that allows a property with off-street parking to use their off-street parking for outdoor dining, our recommendation as staff was to make it consistent with what we heard related to 0922, which is much more broad in saying that off-street parking should be used for things beyond just outdoor dining, other types of beneficial land uses that would be compatible with adjacent land uses. And so that was our primary recommendation here, that if a property owner chooses to pay a fee in lieu to use their off-street parking for something other than parking, that they should have the ability to use it for something other than outdoor dining. And because that was just kind of consistent with 0922, and that's just that's the history here. That being said, the legislation does not provide guidance on what that fee in lieu would be. That still would have to be determined by staff and approved by council, and presumably, you know, would have some guidance on exactly how it could be best utilized. But the intent is for it to go into the transportation fund. So, and we approved the legislation with that one condition, that the uses allowed, if someone were to pay this fee in lieu, would be more than just outdoor dining. So,
And Eric, if I could just add that we have
Jump in.
discussed that modification with Alderman Tierney, who sponsored the legislation. And I think she's planning to speak tonight, but she did not intend that the legislation to include that provision. And I think she's preparing an amendment to address that issue, but it hasn't been introduced yet.
Thanks, Jackie. I think that's the extent of it. I just would also add that since this legislation was introduced, there was also another resolution introduced by City Council. I believe it's R5422. It's referenced in the staff report that would further, I believe it was introduced by Alderman Arnett. It would extend the outdoor dining provisions that were allowed during the emergency period of COVID and continue to allow outdoor dining for, I think, another 6 months. So that's happening at the same time. Clearly, there's a number of efforts to try to expand and provide more flexibility for how off-street parking areas are utilized. And this is one of those pieces of legislation.
Can I ask a couple of clarifying questions? So, I mean, the way I see this is basically 09 and 049 are really competing bills, and you know, it wouldn't make sense. You know, one would have to go forward in lieu of the other. You know, whichever. It doesn't make sense. They would both go forward. But it's the question I would have is with respect to, say, restaurants that have no parking available. So say a restaurant on Main Street, for example, that has no parking, they have a special exception to get that parking waived. Would they then have to now pay a fee in lieu because they're, you know, they went through that process?
No.
To you know, to basically get the parking waived? You know, they're not using it for anything else, but they're also getting, you know, essentially relief. So does that include that scenario or not?
I don't know. So we have restaurants that have had, there are a lot of areas of the city where, you know, parking is not required. But if you have, we've had a restaurant where they got a waiver. I don't know that we have any restaurants not in the MX zone where there's ever been a total waiver of parking approved for a new restaurant. You have a lot of restaurants that have been, you know, that predate the 1970, like, for example, Luna's, that never had any parking on the site, and they don't have to provide it. And there's a long, complicated explanation about how that all works. But when someone comes in with a new restaurant, there are restaurants that have gotten reduced amounts of parking required, but I don't know that we have that scenario. So if someone came in and they wanted to use because I think a lot of it's, I go back to the state of emergency, things happen during the state of emergency that have kind of, that, you know, were never approved, but really never approved through a regular zoning process that will have to be addressed at some point when the city council, you know, finalizes their approval of all of this parking related legislation. And the state, you know, the extension of allowing outdoor dining not subject to any zoning regulations ends, then those restaurants will have to come in, and we really have to assess them on a one-by-one basis because, you know, the circumstances are different, unfortunately different for different ones in terms of what processes they will have to go through, or, you know, what they will be able to do. Their outdoor dining, if they apply to have outdoor dining, for example, in their parking lot, it will have to go through a review process that assures that there's ADA accessibility, that they still have, if, you know, and there are other factors, you know, that they will have to address too, in terms of, and if they're retaining some parking on the site and doing outdoor dining, then that parking will have to be legally accessible to code standards. I mean, you know, they're just, there's no simple answer
so
to that question.
it's complicated. Okay, so
It's
the next
complicated.
question I have is, and
Okay.
this may be a little unfair, but getting to this idea of setting the fee in lieu. I mean, can you give me a sense of what the order of magnitude is going to be? I mean, is it $100 a space, $1,000 a space, $10,000 a space? What's your sense? And how many, like total, what's your wag of the number of spaces that might, be put into play here, just to get some sense of order of magnitude?
I don't think that we have, I don't know that any of that has been decided. I mean, that's really.
I know it
becomes-
hasn't been decided. I'm just
Right.
asking for an opinion.
We're not involved in that process of setting the fees. That's done by the city council. But I'm going to suggest that.
Well, Mr. Lashinsky just said staff would come up with a fee. So
I
Yeah,
think-
no,
I'm
we would,
asking what you think it
we
might
would
be.
weigh in on it.
We'd
Yeah, I
weigh
mean,
in
so
on it,
like,
but the
is it 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? I mean,
It's really, we don't have a sense, to be honest. I mean, we have not put any thought into it. And honestly, our economic development manager, Stephen Rice, would probably be taking the lead on that. I mean, he was the person who took the lead on establishing the fee for the non-maritime use legislation. And I mean, he would be looking at a variety of facts. I'm assuming, I'm just kind of thinking, I mean, he would probably be talking with some of the restaurants, kind of understanding what the potential revenue opportunity is there. I mean, that the issue with the fees is often a balancing act, but you're trying to incentivize, make it so it's not discouraging for people to actually use the provision, but you're also trying to, in this case, you'd be trying to generate revenue for transportation, other transportation uses, and it would just, I think that's the logic. I don't think it's impossible to put even a ballpark number on it, to be honest with you.
okay.
But
well,
Eric, I
that's fair.
think that they would also be evaluating that in the context of the fees that have already been set for outdoor dining in,
That's a
the
good
parking,
point. Right.
in parking space, where people have been allowed to lease space from the city downtown and establish parking in there. There was a whole fee structure set up for that I believe related to that was based on how much space you were leasing, and then that was based on how many tables could be accommodated within that space. So there would have to be some equity of application in terms of of the fee structure for that people are paying similar fees for their outdoor dining.
Okay, well, I think that's the answer I was looking for. We can go
Okay.
back and
But once
research
again,
what-
complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we can go back and see what those fees are. We don't have
Right.
to do that now, but that's a good homework problem to get.
Hey,
To
Alex,
get some
I have a
sense
quick,
of that, so, okay.
quick,
Okay.
yeah, I have a quick question. I just,
Yeah.
I heard staff say that the fee, whatever it ends up being, would go to the transportation department. Is that a definite, or is that still being discussed? Or, could this fee in lieu actually end up just going into the general fund?
Well, I think it says in the legislation that it would go
Okay,
into the transportation.
I'm
fund.
trying to read it right now because I didn't take notes on it when I read it first. So I just wanted to confirm that that's a dedicated fund that it would return to.
Yeah, I'm showing it here.
It's
2160,
C on that.
35 C.
Page 2,
Ah,
line.
perfect.
yeah.
Thank you. Yep,
Yep.
I see it.
All right, well, those are the questions I have. Anybody else want to ask?
I have some questions.
Yep.
Mr. Lashinsky, you're on the chopping block again.
Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to read Mr. Chandlemeyer's comments?
I did.
You have?
I have, yeah.
Okay. I want to bring your attention to a couple of things that he said. One of the things as he gets rolling is he criticizes the idea that the funds that are raised should go to build transit, because his observation is that density precedes transit and that transit doesn't precede density. And then what Annapolis has is an undense city. And that putting the cart before the horse is what he thinks is would simply lead to what we have now, which is an inadequate and barely functioning transit system for everybody. You have any thoughts on that conclusion of his?
Yeah, I don't think he's wrong about that. I mean, I think, you know, I think he tries to, he accepts that the revenue from this would be beneficial, but there's some truth to the fact that we don't know how much it's going to be, and running a transit system is, you know, it's in the millions of dollars, and to really have a big impact, you need a lot of money. But that being said, the way that other transportation options are working today, it's not just about running conventional city buses anymore. You know, I mean, the city is going to be rolling out smaller, more nimble electric vehicles soon, and we have a micro mobility program, and we actually get a margin of the revenues from that every month that we can put towards bike infrastructure or really any kind of non automotive infrastructure. So, I mean, I think we kind of have to be thinking more broadly than just conventional transit in terms of how that revenue would be used. But certainly density does build a better transit system. I mean, it just makes it much more viable. And, you know, I mean, there are parts of Annapolis that are viable today, and there's parts that aren't. And, you know, it needs to be there, I think, for the transportation to be sort of financially solvent. But
Well, okay, that's a very good point he put his sights solely on buses. And it's a very good point that there may be other kinds of things other kinds of mobilities, you know, that are put into place, like that they're experimenting with now during the Hillman Garage construction. So I think that's a very interesting point. So that kind of leads me to question whether will all of these other mobility options be run by the Department of Transportation? I don't know that I can answer that, or you might be able to answer it. Can you?
yeah, I think that's the way we're headed.
Okay.
Right now, our planning and zoning is the point on the point of contact for the micro mobility, the bike share and scooter share program. But the plan is to migrate that into Department of Transportation as well. So
it might behoove this legislation. I'm not saying whether I support it or anybody supports it, but if the legislation were to be passed, it might be advisable to change it from money going to the Transportation Department to some language that says that the money should go towards any forms of public transit, not necessarily in the Transportation Department. Yeah.
Well, it says transportation fund. I think it could be more specific, perhaps, you know,
Okay.
that
All right.
and just
Okay.
identify the types of things. But,
Make a note and let the council know that it may not necessarily go to the Transportation Department, but it may go towards some sort of fund dedicated to public mobility. Okay. I'm not saying that I support it or not. I'm just getting rolling here. Now, another point that he makes is that the fee would be paid by the landlord, and that the landlord is not necessarily the restaurant, the restaurant owner, but presumably the fees would get passed down to the restaurant owner tenant, and then he would then pass it down to all of the customers. And Mr. Schandelmeyer's point is that one, not all landlords are going to want to deal with this complication. And number two, that it ends up that the people paying the fee, in other words, all of the customers and not just the people who drove, but that the people paying the fee didn't drive and yet they're paying the fee, the increased costs. And that the fee in some way, which Mr. Schandelmeyer does not specify, says that the fee needs to be put on the driver. He's the one who should be paying the fee. He's the one who needs to see the cost. And that's a very interesting point. I don't know, we began this discussion by asking what kind of money is going to be raised. And now an analogous question is, so how much are these fees going to add to the bill, to any customer's restaurant bill? But do you see Mr. Schandelmeyer's point that it's not me who walks to the restaurant who should be paying the increased cost? It's the driver who drives to the restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I
Okay.
see that his logic is kind of analogous to the benefit of regulating the curb space in the neighborhood, where because certain parts of the city you can park for free, there's no disincentive to drive,
Right.
and he's just simply saying you're not going to discourage driving if it's a fee that's borne by everybody.
Right. Which is interesting, but he comes to ultimately to the conclusion that there should be no fees on anybody. Unless he's I'm not talking about on-street parking, but he says there should be no fees whatsoever on the parking, on-site parking spaces, which get dedicated to whatever uses. And I think that the staff's comment that it should not be limited simply to parking spaces which get devoted to outdoor dining, but people may want to do a flea market, or I don't know what they want to do, drag shows. I don't know what they're going to want to do, but it's up to them to decide what they want to do. So I think, staff's proposal or recommendation that it not be limited simply to spaces that are devoted to outdoor dining, but for any spaces, if the legislation passes. But that's an interesting one. I mean, why should I, who walk to, Domino's Pizza, he talks about, why should I pay for the guy who drives there? But how is it that you're going to get the guy who drives there to pay for it? And unfortunately, Mr. Schandelmeyer is not here to answer that question.
Well, like everything else related to cars, there's a big hidden subsidy.
Right. And I will not ask Mr. Lisinski to answer for Mr. Schandelmeyer. So you're off the chopping block. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have questions before we get into the Teresa, Diane? Ben?
Nope.
All right. So let's open the public hearing on ordinance 4922. And again, this will also stay open until our next meeting. And anybody can submit comments that we'll discuss in the interim at our next meeting. One thing that I didn't mention for the prior hearing that I would like to for this is want to make sure that all of the comments that we did receive get put into our minutes, and I'm sure Kimberly is keeping track of all that as she always says. But I just wanted to say that explicitly so that we get those comments in the minutes, so people know certainly in that way what comments were submitted, and they can go look at them if they want. So we have signed up. Do we have anybody from the public signed up?
No, we have no one from the public
Okay.
who submitted comments on this legislation. However, Alderman Tierney is here.
Yeah, I was just getting to there. And Alderman Tierney, do you want to say anything about the legislation? I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you for having me. I did submit testimony It's on E-Tracket. I don't want to repeat myself, but I think I do if, I guess this is testimony. Couple of things that were mentioned tonight. I think this ordinance is misconstrued as a competition with 09-22. I would argue that 09-22, that would only be true if 09-22 in and of itself was to accommodate outside dining. 09-22 can continue and have a life of its own on waiving parking, period. We have an existing situation, we'll possibly have additional situations where a restaurant opts to use their parking lot for an addition or for an alternate use.
So if I could stop you there though, and just clarify that, if say just play the thought experiment that 09-22 passes, so it basically there's no minimum parking requirements. How is the parking lot? I mean, a parking lot sort of has no meaning anymore with respect to it's just part of the restaurant. So it, you know, they would have to go through whatever process is related to restaurants, and whether it's a parking lot or an addition on the building or whatever. But I don't see how
That they're not missed.
I don't see how these two make sense.
Yeah, well, I think the unfortunate thing is, I think you can look at this, you have to look at this as a standalone bill to accommodate outside dining in parking lots. And let me just give you the logical reason for this. We had the pandemic and that was just sort of all over the place, no rules, regs and whatever. And downtown was first, as Eric mentioned, Stephen Rice worked on the parklet situation, which is the where the restaurants are going out into a public street and taking up parking spaces, and a fee was attributed to them. And we have adopted a rules and regs and policy and all that for that to, it's a program. And concurrently with that, would like, speaking from the mayor's initiative on outside dining, would like to have a program for outside dining next spring, next April. And I believe that restaurants, you know, I think that this is just as important as parklets. Restaurants talk to each other. I think that there should be a policy for this situation as well as the one that we have downtown. So there was this attempt again to amend 09-22, and that was not germane to the legislation. So this is the standalone bill, but also it is tied into 09-22 in the sense that 09-22 did, thanks to my colleague Alderman Arnett, generate this great study about the dining. And I quoted some of the excerpts from that study that said two things: that if this continues, the evaluation of what it costs the city, whether it be capital fees or what have you, should be evaluated. The other component that was brought up in this study, there was a survey of how many people actually drove and what parking spaces were utilized and blah, blah, blah. And I think the number was, I don't want to be wrong here, I think it was 70%. So therefore, hypothetically, you could be, wait a minute, let me just I just want to make sure I have the right. Yeah, most patrons, 73% parked on a public street, less than 2 blocks away from the restaurant. So that introduces the logic that, gee, by using these parking spaces for an alternate use, it does put a burden on a public space that you could put a monetary value on. Mm-hmm. These are the things that are going to be discussed when you evaluate each restaurant for the fee. There is a rumor going around, you know, that we're going to charge $10,000 because of capital expenses. That's not true. Mayor Buckley has discussed this, and it basically is an evaluation that we say in the bill based on the size of the restaurant and the number of spaces. I think it is a different calculation than what you have downtown, because those are revenue driving spaces. You know, we would never charge that much for this. You know, those are metered spaces. And I think the pricing was done by dynamic pricing, that the closer you were downtown, the higher the fee and all that. And Steve Rice was very helpful in determining that, as well as he would be on this. And there'll have to be some consensus on on what the capital expense is, you know, that extension of whatever. I don't know how much of a part of that would be. I'm trying to answer that question about the magnitude of the fee, but the way the bill reads is that it is based on the repurposing of the number of parking spaces and the restaurant size. It's got to, you know, it's got to be economically viable for the restaurant, because the whole objective of this is to continue outside dining. The other question is the budget. As you know, our budget is set up into funds, enterprise funds. One of them is called the Transportation Fund. So that Transportation Fund is where those expenses, whether they be that are, you know, managed by the Department of Transportation, you know, whether it be microtransit, transit, et cetera, it would flow through that. You know, a fund is a fund, so it goes, to answer Diane's Commissioner's Butler's question, it goes into a fund that is dedicated for these options. My understanding, we have a new transportation director, and he did say to the city council that they are exploring, this is really exciting, expanding the VIA program, which is, as Commissioner Waldman said, is under the AMRP umbrella right now, but we will be looking to expand that. And so that's an exciting component of the transportation budget. I think that was, I just wanted to offer those clarifications on the assumption that you read my testimony.
Yeah. So
And-
let me see if I can reframe this. And I think some of the comments you've made have crystallized this for me. So let me see if I can reframe it, and you tell me if you think this is right. This is really not about minimum parking requirements. It's really about an analog to what happens with restaurants downtown who are paying a fee to use, you know, public parking spaces in the street for outdoor dining. This is really the private parking analog to that, so that they're essentially doing the same thing. One's using private spaces, one's using public spaces, but it's really not about, I mean, 0922 is about the philosophical argument of whether minimum parking requirements make sense or not. This has really nothing to do with this. This is really about outdoor dining. I mean, is that did I capture that right?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I mean, I was having trouble keeping all this straight in my mind, and I think now I get it.
Yeah,
So, okay, thanks.
thank you.
And anybody else have questions for Alderwoman Tierney?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pline, for pointing that out. I now see it I think in a better perspective. But Ms. Tierney,
Yes.
so why should it be limited only to parking spaces that are repurposed into outdoor dining? Why should it be limited to that?
Well, ask me that question again, because I am going to amend it with staff help on not limiting it to outside dining, but I don't know if that's what you were asking.
Yeah, exactly that. So,
Okay, yeah.
Okay, fine. We'll talk about next meeting.
Yeah, it
We'll
will.
hear something on that. Okay, good. Thank you.
And
Nothing
that.
more. Gotcha.
Okay, well, anybody else have questions? So I think at that point, I think we can finish up with this and keep the hearing open. So do you want to give some testimony, Alderman Arnett?
Yeah, I
don't want,
would.
I don't want
would.
you to
I
have a
am-
repartee with Alderwoman Tierney, but if you want
No.
to give some testimony on this, please do so.
Right. So I did give you a written testimony, and I think it's sufficient. I would say, though, that for me, and I think others, this is an either or. It's either 09 or 049. You can't have both of them, but I do agree with Alderwoman Tierney, and I've worked with her on this. Principal purpose for this is to set the requisite so that restaurants can apply for outdoor dining. But I also agree that the legislation does not exclude other flexibilities. And that may be a strength or a weakness. And I do comment on that in my comments to you. And that's something we'll have to determine. I do think the fees are going to be very much similar, at least in my mind, to the sidewalk cafe fees, and are not going to be prohibitive. And I do think that we really do need to be open to other alternatives than the diesel buses and even buses in terms of transportation. The irony of this legislation 09 to me is that it is much more in keeping with Professor Shoup's argument about requiring off-street dining. And the part where it's similar to that is that we require restaurants, if they're not providing that, to pay some fee. And in Professor Shoup's paradigm, that fee should be returned back to the affected community. I don't think this legislation is quite there yet, and maybe leaving it more broad than just going into the transportation department fund may be a way that can happen. So I think we have a way to go to get this legislation refined to be where it's going to do what we need it to do. That's all I would add.
Thanks. And I would point out that with respect to the high cost of free parking, there is an, I think Alderman Chandlemeyer pointed this out in his testimony, his written testimony, is this issue of who pays the fee is pretty fundamental to that argument. And having the restaurants pay that is not, that's not simpatico with the arguments made in the high cost of free parking. It should be more of a user fee. Somebody who wants to use that that function, in this case parking, would pay for it, and then the money that was collected would get returned to the immediate area, whether it's for capital improvements or whatever. Anyway, so
as long as Eric's going to administer that program.
Okay, so anybody else? Anybody have any questions for Alderman Arnett? Or any other questions about public testimony? If not, we will leave it as open for next meeting, and so we'll finish up both of these public hearings next time and have our deliberations on them next time. So that brings us to the end of the agenda. And so I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
In a second.
I'll second.
All right. I presume no discussion, but I'll ask.
No
right.
discussion.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All righty. We are adjourned until January 6th, I believe. That's correct? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.